Hello, hello, and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today we'll be diving back into the history of Camarillo State Hospital and discussing many of the legislative changes that occurred around the mid-20th century that changed the landscape of state hospitals. Trigger warnings for this episode include the use of outdated and ableist language. My main source will be the Images of America book on Camarillo State Hospital by Evelyn S. Taylor and Mary E. Holt. All other sources will be listed at the end of the episode transcript. So for now, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Camarillo State Hospital. We left off last time in the mid-1950s when the patient population at Camarillo State Hospital had reached its peak at over 7,200 patients. Psychotropic medications had been introduced that allowed patients to stabilize and return to the community. Research in the field of psychiatry was taking off, and Camarillo soon joined in the effort. According to the Images of America book, quote, in early 1960, a research project at the hospital conducted by Dr. John Woodard, director of the Neuropathic Research Library, studied the brain using photomicrographics, or pictures taken through a microscope. It had only recently been discovered that the reticular activating system of the brain, which is a group of cells in the brainstem, determined consciousness. Camarillo was the only hospital in the country at the time interested in examining this area and its relation to mental issues. John Dreyer, head of the medical photography department who had worked with Boris Karloff, among other notable actors, assisted Dr. Woodard by taking photographs of the brain and viscera to be autopsied. The hospital autopsy/observation room and cadaver storage were located in the basement of the RT building. End quote. I always tell my patients that even today, we know more about space than we do about our own brains. And I'm impressed, really, that Camarillo was such a pioneer for research efforts in this area. There were many people who had been patients at Camarillo who later went on to give back to the hospital in various ways. In 1961, Los Angeles businessman Perry Whiting, owner of the Los Angeles Building Supply Company, who had been a patient in the 1940s, willed $98,465.90 to Camarillo to be used, quote, for the benefit of patients. The hospital used this donation to construct a swimming pool near the South Quad. It was used until 2004 when it was demolished. By 1963, the patient population had decreased to a little over 6,200. That same year, the American Psychiatric Association awarded Camarillo with a Bronze Service Achievement Award for its introduction of a new one-hour admission procedure. Camarillo continued to conduct important and innovative research. In 1963, Camarillo was one of 5 state hospitals that was studying ways to detect very early congenital deformities. According to Taylor and Holt, quote, doctors looked at phenylketonuria, or PKU, found in approximately 1 in 20,000 children, which is a rare inherited defect in the enzyme system. They discovered that a buildup of the amino acid phenylalanine causes brain damage, but that management is possible with the elimination of certain proteins from the baby's diet. End quote. Years later, Camarillo would conduct research on spinal ailments and the possible connections to developmental disabilities and mental illness. Also in the early to mid-1960s, Camarillo noticed that patients who had discharged had difficulty finding employment in the community. To help with this, the hospital established a vocational rehabilitation program with the assistance of the Jewish Vocational Services and used the hospital bakery as a teaching facility for 120 men aged 18 to 45. Taylor and Holt add that, quote, a trained vocational counselor supervised the workshops. The patients learned not only the art of baking, but also, more importantly, socialization skills, such as how to get along with fellow workers and supervisors, and how to overcome the fear of making mistakes. Other on-the-job training projects included groundskeeping, janitorial, painting, sewing, and upholstery. The Vocational Services Department began expanding, and patients were able to learn all sorts of different skills, such as shrink wrapping, blister packing, and skin packaging products. Patients would be able to complete jobs like inspecting, cleaning, assembling, collating, recycling, and wine labeling. Now, longtime listeners of the show know the significance of 1963 in regard to mental health law in the United States. This is when President John F. Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act of 1963 into law just 3 weeks before his assassination. Essentially, the law dictated that federal funds would be funneled into community mental health centers with the intent of lowering the population at state hospitals. The hope was that by treating patients with psychiatric medications, more could be treated on an outpatient basis rather than needing to be institutionalized long-term. $150 million of federal funding targeted the introduction of these community mental health centers to take the burden off state hospital treatment. So the already declining numbers of patients at state hospitals would now take off significantly. Remember that in 1963, the patient population at Camarillo had been just over 6,200. By 1967, only 4 years later, the population had dropped significantly to 3,690. That's how quickly the Community Mental Health Act went into effect. It had to change the dynamics of the state hospitals so much during that time. It was also in 1967 that the name of the hospital was changed to Camarillo State Hospital and Developmental Center. There were significant structural changes that took place as well. Children and adolescents were finally separated from adult treatment for the first time, and different programs catered to different types of needs. For instance, in the Developmental Center, Program 7 became the Physical and Social Development Program for patients over 14 with developmental disorders. These patients had physical and developmental delays but were generally behaviorally stable. Program 8 was known as the Behavior Adjustment Program, which was, quote, designed to train developmentally disabled persons who need to develop motivation, self-control, and socially acceptable ways of interacting with and relating to others, end quote. Program 9 was a habilitation program, which was aimed at higher functioning patients who were close to returning to the community. They took academic classes, engaged in social activities, and learned job skills. And finally, there was Program 11, the terribly named Sensory Deprivation Program, which was for folks who were deaf or had hearing loss. And here I was envisioning some horrible white room devoid of sound, but thankfully that was not the case. From 1968 to 1969, Camarillo housed 451 developmentally disabled patients and 2,505 mentally ill patients. That number would continue to drop dramatically each year. In 1968, Camarillo started a charter with the Boy Scouts of America, Troop 239. According to Taylor and Holt, quote, although technically their ages, because all scouts were over 21, disqualified them from traditional membership, they participated in numerous activities, including training in basic first aid, creating hospital floats for city parades, clearing cactus from the hospital land, camping in the wild, and joining other troops in gatherings throughout the county, end quote. I really like that they included this and made it part of skills building and socialization treatment. Many changes to the mental health treatment in California came at the end of the 1960s with the introduction of the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act in 1967, or LPS for short. According to Disability Rights California, the law was named after its authors, State Assemblyman Frank Lanterman and California State Senators Nicholas C. Petrus and Alan Short. The LPS Act sought to, quote, end the inappropriate, indefinite, and involuntary commitment of persons with mental health disorders. It also established a right to prompt psychiatric evaluation and treatment in some situations and set out strict due process protection for mental health patients, end quote. People in California may be familiar with short-term LPS holds like the 5150 hold. This is the law that started those holds. According to Taylor and Holt, revisions to the LPS Act in 1969, quote, removed the state's responsibility of providing mental health care by transferring it to counties with at least 100,000 residents. A pre-screening process determined what type of care was required. LPS required that for involuntary hospitalization, a person must be dangerous to himself, dangerous to others, or unable to provide himself with food, clothing, or shelter because of a mental disorder. The legislation also provided for strict time limitations for involuntary hospitalization, an initial 72-hour period for evaluation and treatment, and 14 days for intensive treatment. A judge, secretary, bailiff, public defender, and deputy district attorney conducted court proceedings to provide hospital clients with the right of due process. Most of the hearings involved writs of habeas corpus, that is, patients requesting release from the hospital, end quote. Finally, for the first time, there was a formal legal process and time limits to patients getting committed. No longer could patients be detained indefinitely. By 1970, there were 2,155 mentally ill patients at Camarillo. By 1974, the number had decreased to 1,478 mentally ill patients and 633 developmentally disabled patients. On the developmental training side of the hospital, residents had access to adult education, which was a joint effort of the hospital and Ventura College, the latter providing teachers and teaching assistants. The hospital provided the space, equipment, and supplies. Academic education was available to residents over the age of 21 and was divided into 3 levels: primary, academic readiness, and academic. Residents also had access and use of the auditorium, a bowling alley, and the Big Sky Rustic Camp, where patients could gather in the evenings to sing songs and roast marshmallows. Once residents with developmental disorders had reached their maximum benefit at the hospital, they could be sent to any number of different locations. Some were sent to licensed nursing home for extended care. Others went to intermediate care facilities. Some went home to their families, and some went to other types of facilities for folks with developmental disabilities. The Developmental Center also introduced a program in 1972 that I have mixed feelings about. Like many things, it's easy to look back in retrospect and see how the program could be well-intended, but also problematic. In October 1972, the hospital started a foster grandparent program. According to a document on the Developmental Center called Toward a Better Tomorrow, the program is described like this, quote, "The program was designed to enable low-income senior citizens to supplement their incomes by providing loving person-to-person services to developmentally disabled residents. Each foster grandparent adopts 2 residents and spends 2 hours per day, 5 days a week with each of them. Some activities they share are talking, reading, playing, singing, visiting the library or canteen, and going on occasional trips to nearby communities," end quote. Maybe I'm just jaded, but I see so much potential for liability. Either party could be taken advantage of, although the concept is really cute. I'm sure when it worked well, it worked really well, but I can't help but consider the times when it may not have gone well. Imagine going on an outing and losing a resident, or either party causing harm to the other. I love the idea, but today something like this would have to be closely monitored if it could be implemented at all. There was also a group called the Green Line Parent Group Incorporated, which they described as, quote, "a nonprofit corporation whose members include the parents, guardians, and relatives of developmentally disabled residents of Camarillo State Hospital and other persons and organizations sympathetic to the purposes of the group," end quote. Now, this idea I really like because this group seems to serve as an outside third-party oversight group, and I think that's really important for accountability. Deinstitutionalization really ramped up in the late 1960s and early 1970s. As early as 1973, according to Taylor and Holt, there were plans to close Camarillo. Then Governor Ronald Reagan had a plan to phase out all state hospitals within 10 years and replace them with community-based facilities. There were 15 California state hospitals when Reagan became governor in 1967, and 4 closed not too long afterward. But public outcry saved the state hospitals, at least for a short while. Only 2 years after talking about closing, Camarillo State Hospital became licensed as a facility in 1975, the first year for state hospitals. They had always seemed to earn top recognition from oversight committees. Also in 1975, a fire with an unknown origin caused $250,000 of damage to an office, to the Haggerty Museum, the Haggerty Auditorium, and a recreational building. According to Taylor and Holt, quote, "Lost were musical instruments, arts and crafts materials, phonographic records, and books," end quote. More excitingly, in 1975, according to Taylor and Holt, patient Michael Green became the first hospital representative ever to participate in the International Special Olympic Games held in Michigan, where he participated in the softball throw. Michael won 3rd place at the semifinal state games held earlier in UCLA, which propelled him to Michigan. 1977 was a busy and eventful year for Camarillo. It began in January when a patient attempted to escape by crawling through a 1,200-foot-long pipe near the entrance road to avoid capture. Taylor and Holt note that, quote, "Personnel literally tunneled in after the escapee, who kept ahead of them until the pipe was cut from above ground and the patient pulled out," end quote. The Psych Tech program, which had started at Camarillo in 1971, developed into a comprehensive training program in 1977. According to Taylor and Holt, quote, "The program began with an initial 4-week candidacy period and then 582 hours of classroom instruction and 1,082 hours of laboratory training packed into 48 weeks. Students also received instruction in behavioral science and nursing science/pharmacology. Class size ranged from 30 to 40 students," end quote. And just as a side note, laboratory training in this sense is another way of talking about clinical rotations throughout the hospital. In the summer of 1977, hospital employees formed a softball team and held tournaments with other state hospitals like nearby Atascadero State Hospital. Not to be outdone, that same year, patients formed a Special Olympics floor hockey team, which was the only floor hockey team in Ventura County at the time. They practiced twice a week for 3 hours and played 4 tournaments in 8 months. Fans cheered on the team with purple and gold pom-poms. Holidays were celebrated as well. For Halloween 1977, staff arranged for a Halloween parade and carnival, complete with a high school marching band and lots of fire trucks. Taylor and Holt point out that over 250 community members participated, including high school students and Grand Marshal Mayor Rod Moore of Camarillo, Hospital Executive Director Clinton Rust, and, of course, Miss Camarillo herself. Once again, Camarillo was the site of interesting research. According to Taylor and Holt, quote, "In 1977, Russell Lockhart, director of the Camarillo Neuropsychiatric Institute research program, studied the dreams of cancer patients to explore a possible relationship between dreams and diseases. He questioned if there was a correlation between the type and nature of a dream and a disease, whether dreams are prognostic, and if dreaming can actually aid treatment," end quote. Now, disappointingly, there is no further information answering these questions in the book, so if anyone knows the results of the study, please let me know. And in 1981, the hospital gained a petting zoo. Quote, the petting zoo consisted of a donkey, geese, goats, guinea pigs, ducks, rabbits, chickens, pigeons, and rats. It began as a, quote, pet project, haha, in 1981, with the conjunctive effort by Camarillo and Moore Park Community College's Exotic Animal Training and Management Program. The zoo was made possible by parent and staff support and Moore Park's willingness to supply the animals with supervision by 2 advanced students. Once you set even the most aggressive child down with a cuddly animal, that child will just sort of glow all over, commented Jerry Shern of volunteer services at the hospital. Donations paid for the feed, while the compound was built by Moore Park students and hospital children from scraps and surplus materials. If we've had any complaints so far, Shern said, they are from adults who wonder why the program isn't available to them, end quote. And I'll add a side note here that my hospital has an animal-assisted therapy program with 2 therapy dogs, and there's a pretty strict vetting process for who is allowed to participate. Obviously, patients at high risk of violence or those with a past history of harm to animals are not allowed to participate. But the patients who are part of the program absolutely love it, and the staff do too. By 1984, the patient population of Camarillo had dwindled to 630 mentally ill patients. It's truly amazing to me that in the span of fewer than 30 years, the hospital went from over 7,200 patients to just over 600. I can't imagine what that change had to be like for the staff who worked during those decades. In 1987, Camarillo became accredited by the Joint Commission on the Accreditation of Hospitals. At that time, fewer than 25% of state hospitals in the U.S. met criteria for accreditation. The numbers of patients continued to decline as state hospitals around California began to close their doors. There was more talk of closing Camarillo, more seriously this time. By 1995, there were 495 residents in the Developmental Center and 394 mentally ill patients. By August 1996, there was a total of 866 patients. In January 1996, then-Governor Pete Wilson ordered Camarillo to be closed based on the low census and budget concerns. According to Taylor and Holt, quote, officials estimated that the state would save $23 million per year, end quote. As with anything, it seems it comes down to money. The following year, in March 1997, quote, 2 parent groups filed a lawsuit against the Department of Developmental Services, alleging that closure would cause irreparable harm to the patients. It resulted in an order that the hospital would not close until the state ensured that the patients would receive comparable care at other facilities. That was the best that anyone could hope for. What is ironic about the closing is that people on both sides of the fence fiercely and passionately believed that they had the most humane solution. What they failed to comprehend was that decades before, the decision had already been made. And once that ball began to roll downhill, there was no stopping it, end quote. And it's true, there was no stopping it. Quote, despite protests and injunctions, emotions, and rationale, on July 1st, 1997, the once largest state hospital this side of the Mississippi River lost its 60-year war and shut its doors officially and forever, end quote. The question then became, what do we do with the space now? There were multiple options offered. Turn it into a reform school, convalescent hospital, and minimum to medium security prison for mentally disabled sex offenders, but nothing came from it. What had been brewing since January 1996, however, was that California State University was looking for a site for its 23rd campus. Camarillo seemed like just the right spot, and later, the land was transferred over to the CSU system. Quote, in 1998, a conveyance ceremony occurred celebrating Ventura County's first four-year university. CSU Northridge's satellite campus in the city of Ventura moved to the new site in July 1999 to initiate classes in the fall as CSUN at Channel Islands. In April 2002, President Richard Rush became CSUCI's second president, and in August, California State University Channel Islands held its official opening ceremony, end quote. And I was able to visit the campus this past December, and it's beautiful. The old buildings that once housed patients are still standing, but there's a mix of more modern buildings now. It was peaceful and quiet when I was there, must have been winter break, but I loved the stillness of the site. And there are reminders around the campus of its history and the people who once called it home. And that's the history of Camarillo State Hospital. I do want to recognize that most of what I portrayed in this episode is a positive, treatment-forward approach. There are a number of ways that Camarillo did quite well, and they were recognized for their accomplishments. As with any hospital from this period, there were a number of patient abuses that took place that never should have occurred. I believe that most people who work in facilities like Camarillo did the best they could with what they were able to do, but as with any similar facility, there are those that do not. We'll see a little more of this perspective, unfortunately, in the next episode, where I'll discuss the history of Camarillo's children and adolescent programs. So stay tuned for that. As always, thank you so much for listening. Extra special shout out this week to Solstice for being the latest to support the show on Patreon. Thank you so much for that. Remember that you too can support the show either on Buzzsprout or on Patreon for as little as $3 a month. But the best way you can support the show is to leave a rating and review wherever you are listening. I would appreciate that more than you know. And as always, remember the words of Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.